In a cluttered thrift store on the edge of town, Edward Mercer stood frozen, the small wooden frame trembling in his hands. The faded photograph showed a thin boy in a wheelchair, smiling despite the cast on his leg and the bruises on his face. It was him, 35 years ago, before the surgeries, before the fortune, before he'd buried his past so deeply even his closest associates didn't know. The timestamp in the corner matched the month of his accident. The hospital wing behind him was unmistakable, but the photo had never been in his possession. Who had taken it? Who had kept it all these years? And why had it surfaced now, just as his company prepared to announce its biggest acquisition yet? Could the timing be mere coincidence, or was someone sending him a message? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Edward's fingers traced the edge of the wooden frame as he navigated the winding coastal road back to his estate. The Pacific glimmered in the late afternoon sun, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. He'd meant to spend only a few minutes in that thrift store, a curious detour during his rare venture into the small coastal town. Now, the photograph burned in his hands like a live coal. "Welcome home, Mr. Mercer," intoned the silky voice of Minerva, his home's AI system, as the gates swung open. "Your schedule for this evening includes a call with Tokyo at 7 and final review of tomorrow's acquisition documents at 8:30. "Cancel both," Edward replied, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "Route all calls to Diana, unless it's an emergency." The mansion, 14,000 square feet of steel, glass, and perfect order, greeted him with climate-controlled precision. Every element had been designed to his exact specifications. The slightly elevated chair heights, the precise angle of the stair treads, the subtle handrails disguised as decorative elements. Accommodations for a weakness no one was allowed to see. Edward placed the photograph on his desk in the study, a room lined with first-edition books he'd collected but rarely read. The mansion was full of such perfectly curated illusions. Minerva, increase light on desk by 40% and engage privacy mode. The photograph seemed even more incongruous under the harsh light. Edward's childhood had been carefully excised from his official biography. Mercertech's founder was known for his brilliance, his reclusiveness, his exacting standards, not for having spent 2 years in a wheelchair after the accident that killed his father. His phone vibrated. Diana, the only person who could reach him in privacy mode. "Edward, the Access Tech legal team sent over revised terms. Their CEO is pushing for an answer by morning." "It'll have to wait," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. In 15 years, Diana had never heard him delay a business matter. "Are you all right? You sound—" "I'm fine. Just working on something unexpected." After hanging up, Edward studied the photograph more carefully. The hospital room was unmistakable. St. Mary's in Oak Ridge, the small town where he'd spent his childhood. The timestamp, June 1990, 2 months after the accident. His memory of that period was fragmented, like pieces of a dropped mirror, sharp, dangerous to handle, reflecting different angles of the same broken image. He'd been 10 years old. The doctors had initially said he might never walk again. His mother had disappeared 6 months later, unable to cope with her grief and his disability. By 12, he'd taught himself to walk again, forcing his damaged body through excruciating daily exercises. By 14, he'd hidden his limp well enough to pass as normal. By 18, he'd won a full scholarship to MIT and left Oak Ridge behind forever, or so he'd thought. Edward opened his safe and removed a yellowing newspaper clipping, the only item he'd kept from those years. "Local tragedy, man killed, son critically injured in highway collision." His father's name was there in smudged ink. His own name appeared only as the man's 10-year-old son, who was transported to St. Mary's with severe injuries. The photograph showed what came after, a thin boy with hollow eyes, trying to smile for the camera. But who had taken it? His mother had barely been able to look at him by then, drowning in her own grief and guilt. The nurses, a doctor, and how had it ended up in a thrift store 35 years later? Edward realized his hand was trembling slightly, a rare breach of his perfect self-control. Tomorrow, Mercer Tech would announce its acquisition of Access Tech, the company whose revolutionary wheelchair design would transform mobility for thousands. The press release, carefully crafted to emphasize innovation and market expansion, made no mention of Edward's personal connection to accessibility technology. Perhaps it was time to face the past he'd so carefully buried, before it found ways to surface on its own. Sleep eluded Edward that night. At 3 a.m, he carried the photograph to his private lab in the East Wing. The space-housed equipment worth millions, technology that had built his empire and some that wouldn't, reach the public for years. Tonight, it would serve a more personal purpose. Minerva, activate Imaging Station 3. A sleek workstation hummed to life. Edward placed the photograph under the high-resolution scanner, watching as the system captured every detail, every faded color, every fiber of the aged paper. Enhance Sector B7 through D9. The scanner focused on the background of the hospital room, revealing details invisible to the naked eye. A nurse's clipboard hanging on the wall. The edge of a TV showing what looked like a baseball game. The corner of a book on the bedside table, something about computers. Edward's breath caught. He remembered that book. Someone had brought it during his hospital stay, a basic introduction to programming. He'd devoured it, finding escape in the logical world of code while his body failed him. That book had been his first step toward becoming who he was now, but who had given it to him. Edward turned the photograph over, nothing but blank yellowed paper. He scanned it anyway, then activated a specialized filter. Faint impressions detected, Minerva announced. Applying enhancement. Protocol. Slowly, ghostly letters appeared on the screen. St. Mary's Children's Ward, Oakridge, 1990. Edward felt a chill. Someone had written this, someone who'd been there. The handwriting wasn't his mother's. Her few notes from that time had been nearly illegible, her once elegant script deteriorating with her mental state. He closed his eyes, trying to summon memories of that hospital room. The antiseptic smell, the beep of monitors, the way the spring sunshine felt cruel, highlighting a world he could no longer run through. His father had been killed instantly in the crash. Edward had woken up 3 days later to a body that wouldn't respond below the waist, and a mother he barely recognized, her face gaunt with grief and guilt. The doctors had spoken in careful, measured tones about spinal trauma, about surgeries, about managing expectations. Edward opened his eyes and stared at his reflection in the darkened lab window. At 55, he still cut an impressive figure. Tall, fit, silver threading his dark hair in a way that business magazines called distinguished. Only those with trained eyes might notice the slight unevenness in his gait, the subtle reinforcement in his left shoe, the way he always positioned himself near support when standing for long periods. He'd spent decades and millions ensuring. No one noticed. Edward pulled up his private database, accessing files no one else could reach. He searched for Oakridge and St. Mary's Hospital, finding the basic information he'd collected years ago to ensure no connections could be traced. The hospital still existed, modernized now. The town had grown somewhat, but remained largely unchanged, a quiet community about 3 hours from his current location. On impulse, he searched for the thrift store receipt from earlier that day. Second Chance's Thrift Emporium, Coastal Village, shopping center. A quick call would be logical, asking about the photograph's provenance. But something pulled at him. A need to see Oakridge again, to trace this mystery to its source. Minerva, contact Diana. Request that she clear my schedule for the remainder of the week. Site personal research project. Diana typically requires more specific information, Mr. Mercer. She'll have to make an exception. Edward placed the photograph back in its frame and carried it to his bedroom. He propped it on the nightstand, the boy in the wheelchair staring at the man he'd become. For the first time in decades, Edward allowed himself to really look at that child, the determined set of his jaw, the fear he couldn't quite hide, the loneliness that radiated from him. "Who found you?" he whispered to the image. "And why have you found me now?" By morning, Edward had made his decision. He stood in his expansive closet, bypassing his usual tailored suits for more casual attire. Dark jeans, a simple button-down shirt, leather jacket, clothing that wouldn't draw attention, clothing that didn't belong to Edward Mercer, tech titan. Diana met him at the private airfield, concern etched across her face. In 15 years as his executive assistant, she'd never seen him like this. "Your jet is ready," she said, handing him a slim folder. "I've cleared your schedule through Friday, but the board is questioning the timing with the Access Tech announcement. Tomorrow. They'll have to manage their questions." Edward took the folder without opening it. "If there's an emergency, a real one, you can reach me. Otherwise, I'm unavailable." Diana's professional composure slipped slightly. "Edward, what's going on? You've never postponed an acquisition meeting. Is there something I should know?" For a moment, he considered telling her. Diana had been with him longer than anyone else in his adult life. But explaining would mean revealing the carefully constructed mythology of Edward Mercer, the self-made genius who'd built an empire through sheer brilliance and determination, not the damaged boy from a broken family who'd clawed his way out of a wheelchair. "It's a personal matter," he said finally. "I'll be back for the final signing next week." James, his pilot of 12 years, greeted him with the usual professional nod as he boarded the sleek jet. "Morning, Mr. Mercer. Weather's clear to Oak Ridge Regional. Should be a smooth flight." Edward settled into his customized seat, designed to alleviate pressure on his left side during long flights, another accommodation hidden in plain sight. "First time to Oak Ridge, sir?" James asked as they reached cruising altitude. Edward stared out the window at the coastline, giving way to rolling hills. "No," he said after a long pause. "I grew up there." James raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, he offered a kindness Edward rarely encountered, the space to sit with his thoughts. 3 hours later, the jet touched down at the small regional airport serving Oak Ridge and surrounding communities. Edward declined the waiting car service, instead renting an unremarkable sedan under a rarely used alternate identity. Oak Ridge had changed, yet remained fundamentally the same. The main street had been revitalized with boutique shops and cafes, but the bones of the small town he remembered were still visible. The courthouse with its white columns, the park where he'd never been able to play normally, the library where he'd hidden from pitying looks. Edward drove slowly, memories surfacing with each familiar landmark. There was the elementary school he'd returned to after months in the hospital, navigating halls never designed for a wheelchair. The grocery store where his mother had once forgotten him for 3 hours, lost in her grief, and the bottom of a bottle. The movie theater where kids had stared and whispered. He pulled into the parking lot of the Oak Ridge Inn, a modest hotel that had been renovated since his time, but still retained its small-town charm. The young woman at the reception desk smiled brightly, showing no recognition as he checked in under his alias. "First time in Oak Ridge?" she asked, echoing his pilot's question. "It's been a long time," Edward replied, accepting the room key. His room was simple but comfortable, clean, functional, lacking the exquisite design and technology of his home. Edward placed the photograph on the bedside table and sat heavily on the bed, suddenly exhausted by the weight of returning. That night his dreams were vivid in a way they hadn't been for decades. He was 10 again, wheeling down hospital corridors that stretched endlessly, searching for someone. His father, his mother, both were gone in different ways, but someone had been there, someone had helped him. Who? He woke at dawn, the question still echoing in his mind. St. Mary's Hospital had grown. What Edward remembered as a modest three-story brick building now sprawled across half a block, modern wings extending from the original structure like glass, and steel tentacles. Only the chapel remained unchanged, its stained glass windows casting the same kaleidoscope patterns he remembered from long afternoons staring out his hospital room window. Edward straightened his shoulders and walked through the main entrance, fighting the instinct to turn back. The antiseptic smell hit him immediately. Some things never changed. He approached the information desk where a middle-aged woman looked up with a practiced smile. "I'm doing research on the hospital's history," Edward said, the lie coming easily. "Particularly the children's ward from the early 1990s. Who would be the best person to speak with?" 20 minutes and several redirections later, Edward found himself in the office of Howard Freeman, the hospital's administrative director. Freeman was a compact man with suspicious eyes who clearly viewed Edward's request as an interruption. "A children's ward from the 90s. Freeman shuffled papers on his desk. "That entire section was renovated in 2005. What exactly is your interest, Mr. Merrick?" Edward supplied, using his alias. "I'm researching for a book about regional healthcare development." Another lie. "I'm particularly interested in patient records from June 1990. Freeman's expression hardened. "Patient records are confidential, regardless of age." "Of course," Edward conceded. "I'm more interested in the administrative aspects, staff rosters, visitor policies, layout of the ward. I have a photograph from that period." He produced the photo, watching Freeman's reaction carefully. The administrator studied it, his expression softening slightly. "I wasn't here then, but—" He hesitated. "We do maintain historical archives, mostly for internal documentation." "I would be extremely grateful for a look," Edward said, "and willing to make a substantial donation to the hospital's foundation." The word substantial worked its magic. 30 minutes later, Edward found himself in a cramped basement room, surrounded by boxes of old records, with a young volunteer named Tessa assigned to assist him, or more likely, ensure he didn't access anything inappropriate. "The children's ward records from 1990 should be in these sections," Tessa said, pointing to several shelves. "Though they're not very organized, I'm afraid." Edward thanked her and began methodically working through the files. Staff schedules, equipment inventories, renovation plans, nothing that spoke to him directly until Mercer, he whispered, pulling out a thin folder with his name. His heart raced as he opened it, finding his admission records, treatment notes, and, most surprisingly, payment information. Edward frowned at the notation on the financial summary. "Expenses covered by anonymous donor fund, GG 103. Anonymous donor? His mother had basic insurance, but he knew it hadn't covered everything. He'd always assumed the hospital had written off the remaining costs as charity care. Who was GG 103? Flipping further, he found nursing notes mentioning a primary care nurse, M. Chen, who had established excellent rapport with patient. The name triggered a vague memory. A kind face, gentle hands, someone who spoke to him like a person, not a tragedy. The file contained one last surprise, a note about regular visitor approved by Guardian, see visitor log. But the visitor log wasn't included. Edward's concentration was broken by the sudden constriction in his chest. The cramped room, the smell of old paper, the weight of memories. It was too much. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Was this a heart attack? "Mr. Merrick, are you okay?" Tessa's voice seemed to come from far away. Edward slumped against the shelf, his carefully maintained composure cracking. Tessa was beside him instantly, her voice calm as she talked him through what she correctly identified as a panic attack. "Just breathe with me, that's it. You're safe." When it finally passed, Edward felt drained and embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I don't know what happened." "No need to apologize." Tessa helped him to a chair. "These old archives affect people sometimes, all that history." As Edward prepared to leave, folder discreetly tucked into his jacket, he spotted an elderly Asian woman walking through the hospital lobby. Something about her posture, her deliberate way of moving, struck him as hauntingly familiar. Margaret Chen. It had to be. Edward followed the woman at a distance, his heart pounding. She moved with purpose through the parking lot and drove a modest blue sedan to a residential neighborhood 10 minutes from the hospital. Edward parked across the street from the small, well-kept bungalow where she stopped, gathering his courage before approaching the door. The woman answered his knock with a polite but wary expression that quickly transformed into astonishment. "Edward? Edward Mercer?" Her voice was exactly as he remembered, gentle but firm, with the slight accent he'd found comforting as a child. "Nurse Chen," he said, suddenly feeling 10 years old again. "You remember me?" Come in," she urged, stepping aside. "After all these years, my goodness." The house was modest but warm, filled with books, plants, and mementos of a life well lived. Edward noticed several framed photographs of Margaret with children in hospital beds, a career of caring for those who needed it most. "I go by Margaret. Now that I'm retired," she said, guiding him to a comfortable living room. "It's been 35 years, but I would know you anywhere. Those eyes don't change." She studied his face. "You look so much like your father." The comment struck Edward like a physical blow. No one in his current life had ever known his father. "Tea?" Margaret offered, already moving toward the kitchen. "I still make it the same way you liked it then. A little honey, no milk." Edward was stunned that she remembered such a detail. "Yes, thank you." While she prepared the tea, Edward examined the photos on her mantelpiece, children of various ages, many in hospital beds or wheelchairs, and there, his breath caught, a faded version of the very photograph he'd found in the thrift store. Margaret returned with 2 steaming mugs. "You found it," she said, noticing his fixed gaze. "I always kept a copy." "You took this photo?" Edward asked, his voice barely steady. "I took many of my special patients." She settled into an armchair. "To document their progress, to remind them how far they'd come." She tilted her head, studying him. "And you came so far. I heard about your company, your success. I always knew you would do something remarkable." Edward held his mug tightly, anchoring himself. "I found this photograph in a thrift store yesterday. I don't understand how it got there." Margaret's eyes widened. "That's strange. I gave copies to your mother and to—" She hesitated. "To who?" Edward leaned forward. "The kind man, the one who visited you regularly." Margaret frowned. "I'm sorry, I don't recall his name after all these years. He wasn't family, but your mother had authorized him as a visitor." Edward struggled to process this information. "I don't remember any visitor. You were heavily medicated in the beginning," Margaret explained gently, "and children often block traumatic periods. He came at least weekly, brought you books, especially about computers. He spoke to the doctors about specialized treatments, arranged for consultations." She paused. "I always thought he might be a relative or family friend." Edward shook his head slowly. "There was no one. My father was an only child. My mother had no family left. We were alone." Margaret reached for a handmade blue blanket, folded neatly on a nearby shelf, and placed it in Edward's hands. "I made this for you during your stay. You were always cold from the medication." The soft yarn felt familiar against his fingertips, triggering a cascade of fragmented memories. Margaret reading to him when his mother couldn't bear to visit, the way she'd encouraged him during painful physical therapy sessions, her quiet pride when he'd first managed to shift himself from bed to wheelchair without help. "You were kind to me," Edward said simply, emotion thickening his voice. "You were a special child, so determined." Margaret touched his hand briefly. "I kept journals. During those years, I wrote about all my patients. I might have more details about your time with us and about your visitor." Edward found himself unexpectedly moved. "I would be very grateful to see them." "I'll look for them tonight," Margaret promised. "But tell me, Edward, why now? Why after all these years are you looking back?" Edward left Margaret's house with a promise to return the next day. His mind swirled with new questions as he drove through Oak Ridge, eventually finding himself outside Oak Ridge Elementary School. The building had been renovated, but the basic structure remained. The same broad steps leading to the entrance, the same playground where he'd watched other children run while he sat in his wheelchair. On impulse, he parked and walked to the school office. A security system now required visitors to be buzzed in, a change from his day. "Can I help you?" asked the receptionist, a young woman with a bright smile. "I was hoping to speak with someone who might have been here in the early 90s, Edward explained. "I'm a former student researching the school's history." The receptionist's expression brightened. "You'll want to talk to Mr. Harrison. He was principal here forever, just retired last year. He still comes in on Wednesdays to help with the chess club." She checked her computer. "Which is today. He should be in the library now." Edward thanked her and followed the familiar path. To the library, memories flooding back with each step. The hallway where he'd struggled to manage his books while wheeling himself. The bathroom that hadn't been accessible until someone, he couldn't remember who, had installed simple modifications. The library had been modernized with computers and colorful furniture, but the smell of books remained unchanged. In the corner, an elderly man with a shock of white hair was setting up chessboards while a handful of children watched eagerly. "Mr. Harrison," the old principal looked up, squinting slightly. "Yes, can I help you?" "Edward Mercer. I was a student here, 1990 to 1998. Harrison's face transformed with recognition. "Edward, good heavens!" He turned to the children. "Start practicing the openings we discussed. I'll be right back." He guided Edward to a quiet corner, examining him with undisguised amazement. "I've followed your career, you know. We have a wall of achievement and you're prominently featured, though the photo we have doesn't do you justice." Edward felt strangely moved by the idea that his old school acknowledged him. "I didn't realize anyone here remembered me." "Remember you?" Harrison chuckled. "A mind like yours doesn't come along often. I still tell teachers about the boy who corrected the science textbooks and taught himself calculus by 7th grade. His expression softened, "and who showed more determination than anyone I've ever known. Your journey wasn't easy." "No," Edward agreed quietly. "It wasn't." Harrison gestured to a nearby table. From his briefcase, he pulled out a yearbook and opened it to a marked page. "The year you returned to school after the accident." Edward stared at the class photo, 30 children arranged in neat rows, and on the end, a thin boy in a wheelchair, his face solemn. The contrast between the before and after photos was stark. Before the accident, a smiling child standing between two classmates. After, isolated, separated, different. It was a transition, Harrison acknowledged. "For everyone, but especially for you." "I don't remember much about that time," Edward admitted, "but I've recently found connections to the past that have raised questions." He hesitated. "My wheelchair, for instance. I don't remember how—" "I got it," Harrison's eyebrows rose. "You wouldn't. It appeared rather mysteriously. Your mother's insurance wouldn't cover a proper one, and suddenly this state-of-the-art model arrived at the school. Anonymous donation, they said." "Anonymous," Edward repeated, the word echoing what he'd found in the hospital records. "Same thing. With the modifications to the school," Harrison continued, "someone hired contractors to install ramps, lower certain sinks, widen doorways. The school board hadn't approved funding, but a private citizen covered everything. Do you remember who?" Harrison frowned thoughtfully. "There was a local businessman involved. Quiet fellow. Never wanted recognition. I only met him once or twice." He snapped his fingers. "Raymond Jackson. He owned the garage downtown. He coordinated all the modifications, though I always suspected the funding came from someone else." "And my mother? Do you remember anything about her after?" Harrison's expression grew somber. "She struggled terribly, Edward. The grief, the guilt, it overwhelmed her. When she left, many assumed she'd abandoned you, but it wasn't that simple. What do you mean? She was broken, Harrison said gently. Sometimes the kindest thing a broken person can do is step away before they cause more damage. Edward left the school with Harrison's words echoing in his mind. He'd spent decades believing his mother had simply abandoned him, unable to bear the burden of a disabled child. Was there more to the story? He drove to the address of his childhood. Home, a journey he'd avoided for 35 years. The modest bungalow where he'd grown up should have been at 427 Maple Street, but when he arrived, he found instead a small community center, its bright mural depicting children of various abilities. Playing together, Edward sat in his car, staring at the building that stood where his home should have been. After a moment, he approached the entrance, where a sign read, "Oak Ridge Inclusive Community Center, where everyone belongs." Inside, the space was warm and welcoming. Children's artwork lined the walls, and from a back room came the sound of laughter. A woman in her 40s approached with a professional smile. "Welcome to the Oak Ridge Inclusive Center. I'm Sophia Williams, the director. How can I help you?" "I'm interested in the history of this building," Edward said, looking around. "I used to live here when this was a residence." Sophia's expression brightened. "Oh, you must have lived in the old Peterson house. It was donated to the community about 20 years ago, specifically for creating this center." "Donated?" Edward frowned. "By whom?" "That's actually an interesting story," Sophia said, leading him to her small office. "The donation was anonymous, but with very specific conditions, that the property be used for an inclusive community space, accessible to children with all types of abilities." She rummaged through a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. "We keep the original documentation for historical purposes. The legal papers detailed the donation of the property at 427 Maple Street to the Oak Ridge Community Trust, with strict provisions for its use. The donor's name had been redacted, replaced with a reference to Trust GG 103. Edward's pulse quickened, the same designation from his hospital records. "Have you ever had contact with the donor?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. "Never directly," Sophia replied. "The Trust's lawyers handle everything. They check in yearly to ensure we're meeting the requirements, but they've never revealed their client." She studied Edward curiously. "If you don't mind my asking, when did you live here?" "I left in 1998, Edward replied. "My mother and I—" He paused, unsure how to explain. Sophia nodded sympathetically. "The trust documentation mentioned that the property had special significance to the donor, something about a child who once lived here overcoming significant challenges." She smiled. "Was that you?" Edward didn't answer directly. "What else do you know about the trust?" "Very little," Sophia admitted, "though I've always had the impression that whoever established it had personal experience with disability." She gestured around the office. "The requirements for the center were remarkably specific. Doorway widths, counter heights, specialized equipment, details most people wouldn't think of. Details someone who had used a wheelchair would know." Edward thanked Sophia for her time and walked through the center before leaving. The building that had once been his home, where he'd experienced both the ordinary joys of childhood and the extraordinary trauma that followed the accident, had been transformed into a place of inclusion and possibility. The irony wasn't lost on him. Back in his car, Edward consulted the note where he'd jotted down Raymond Jackson's garage address from his conversation with Harrison. Perhaps the mechanic who'd modified the school would have answers about the mysterious benefactor. When he arrived at the address, he found a modern automotive shop with Jackson and Son emblazoned across the front. Inside, the reception area was busy with customers. A broad-shouldered man in his 30s looked up from the service desk. "Be with you in a sec," he called to Edward before finishing with another customer. When he approached, Edward could see the family resemblance to what he vaguely remembered of the older Jackson. Same strong jaw, same direct gaze. Michael Jackson, The man introduced himself, extending a hand stained with engine grease. "What can we help you with today?" "Actually, I was hoping to speak with Raymond Jackson," Edward replied, shaking the offered hand. Michael's expression sobered. "I'm sorry. My father passed away 5 years ago, heart attack." He studied Edward more closely. "Did you know him?" "Not exactly," Edward said. "I was told he helped modify Oak Ridge Elementary for wheelchair accessibility back in the early 90s. I'm trying to learn more about that project." Michael's face brightened with recognition. "You must be talking about my dad's accessibility crusade. It was one of his proudest achievements." Michael's shift ended 30 minutes later, and he invited Edward to continue their conversation at the diner across the street. Over coffee, Michael shared what he knew about his father's accessibility projects. "Dad was always good with his hands," Michael explained, "but the accessibility work was different. He took it personally, even though he didn't have any disability himself, said it was about evening the playing field." "And he modified the elementary school," Edward prompted. "That and a dozen other buildings around town," Michael confirmed. "The library, the movie theater, the community pool. If a kid in a wheelchair couldn't access it, Dad found a way to fix it." "Do you know who funded these projects?" Michael shook his head. "Dad never said directly. He just mentioned his partner, who provided the financial backing. I got the impression it was someone with resources who preferred to remain anonymous." Edward hesitated, then took a chance. "Would you happen to have any photographs from those projects?" "Sure do. Dad documented everything. He was real proud of that work." Michael pulled out his phone. "I digitized his old photos a few years back. Let me see." He scrolled through images, finally stopping on one that showed Raymond Jackson standing beside a newly constructed ramp at the town library. Next to him stood a well-dressed man in his 40s, face partially turned away from the camera. "That might be the mystery partner," Michael said. "This is the only photo where Dad's not alone or with the construction crew." Edward studied the image, but couldn't make out the man's features clearly. "Would you mind sending me this photo?" After leaving the diner, Edward returned to his hotel, his mind racing with new information. He called Diana for the first time since arriving in Oak Ridge. "Edward, finally," she answered immediately. "The board is getting restless. Access Tech is threatening to walk if you don't personally sign off on the final terms." "Tell them I'll call tomorrow," Edward replied, surprising himself with how little the crisis seemed to matter compared to what he was discovering. "That's not like you," Diana said, concern evident in her voice. "Is everything all right?" "I'm fine. Just following up on something important." "More important than the acquisition we've spent 18 months negotiating?" Edward didn't answer directly. "Diana, I need you to look into something. A trust designated as GG103, possibly established in the early 1990s. It's been involved in donations to various institutions in Oak Ridge, California." Diana's tone shifted to professional efficiency. "I'll see what I can find. Anything else?" "Yes. Check if this trust has any connection to Mercatech or my personal accounts." "Edward, what is this about?" "I'll explain when I return." He ended the call and lay back on the hotel bed staring at the ceiling. His phone chimed with a text from Margaret. "Found my journals from 1990. Come by tomorrow morning?" Edward texted his confirmation, then tried to sleep, but his dreams were fragmented. Hospital corridors, the whir of wheelchair wheels, a shadowy figure bringing books and quiet encouragement. He woke early and drove to Margaret's house, where she welcomed him with fresh coffee and a stack of worn notebooks. "I kept detailed journals during my nursing years," she explained, setting them before him. "I've marked the entries that mention you." Edward opened the first notebook with careful hands. Margaret's neat handwriting documented his early days in the hospital, his injuries, his surgeries, his mother's increasing difficulty coping. And then, a month after his admission, the first mention of a visitor. Mr. G visited EM again today, brought another computer book, and spent an hour reading to him. Mother absent again. Mr. G spoke with Dr. Phillips about specialized therapy options not covered by insurance. Has offered to arrange and fund treatments. Seems genuinely invested in EM's recovery. Edward looked up at Margaret. Who was Mr. G? I only knew him as George or Mr. Griffin, Margaret replied. He wasn't family, as far as I knew, but he had your mother's authorization to visit. He came at least weekly while you were hospitalized. Edward flipped through more entries, finding regular mentions of this mysterious benefactor. Mr. G brought adaptive equipment for EM to practice computer skills. Mr. G consulted with specialists in spinal rehabilitation. Mr. G established trust fund for EM's ongoing medical care and education. Edward's hand froze on the page. Trust fund, Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, I'd forgotten that detail. Near the end of your hospital stay, Mr. Griffin established some kind of trust for your future care and education. Your mother was reluctant at first, but eventually agreed. I remember thinking it was extraordinary. He seemed to be investing in your future when even your mother had begun to lose hope. Edward closed the journal, his mind reeling. His entire narrative of self-made success was being rewritten with every discovery. Who was this man who had shaped his life from the shadows? Armed with a name, George Griffin, Edward began his search at the Oak Ridge Public Library. The building had been modernized, but he remembered spending countless hours here as a child, losing himself in books when reality became too difficult. Tick. Reference librarian, a woman in her 60s named Eleanor, brightened when he mentioned Griffin's name. George Griffin? Of course I remember him. One of our most generous patrons. She led Edward to a quiet study room. He funded our first computer lab back in the 90s, though he refused to let us name it after him. What can you tell me about him? Edward asked. Eleanor's expression softened. A kind man. Successful in business but humble about it. He and his wife Elizabeth lived on Orchard Lane. Beautiful home. They'd lost their son in an accident years before I started working here. She tilted her head curiously. Are you related? There's something in the eyes. Just researching local history. Edward deflected. When did Mr. Griffin pass away? About 10 years ago. Cancer. Eleanor disappeared briefly, returning with a folder of newspaper clippings. Our local history collection. George appears in several articles about community development. Edward thanked her and began sorting through the yellowed clippings. A ribbon cutting at the community pool with Raymond Jackson visible in the background. A business profile describing Griffin as a modest success story who believes in giving back. A notice about anonymous donations to the hospital expansion. In each photograph, Griffin appeared the same, a tall man with kind eyes and a reserved smile, standing slightly apart from the center of attention. Never the focus, always on the periphery. Edward found the obituary last. George Thomas Griffin, 78, described as a local businessman and philanthropist. Survived by his wife, Elizabeth. Preceded in death by his son, Thomas Griffin, Jr. The funeral had been private, but donations were suggested to the Oak Ridge Accessibility Foundation, another organization connected to his mysterious benefactor. Edwards. Her phone rang. Diana. I found something on that trust, she said without preamble. GG 103 is a private charitable trust established in 1990. The full name is redacted in public records, but it's connected to multiple donations in Oak Ridge over the past 30 years. Any connection to me or Mercer Tech? A pause. Yes, GG103 was an early-stage investor in your first company through a shell corporation called Orchard Innovations. They still hold about 2% of Mercer Tech stock, though the shares have never been voted. Edward felt a chill. His benefactor hadn't just helped him recover, he'd financially backed Edward's first venture when no one else would take the risk. After ending the call, Edward drove to the address listed in Griffin's obituary. The house on Orchard Lane was an elegant craftsman, set back from the road behind mature oak trees. A young woman was gardening in the front yard, a toddler playing nearby. "Excuse me," Edward called. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for information about the previous owners, the Griffin family. The woman straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. We bought the house from Mrs. Griffin 5 years ago when she moved to Pine Ridge Retirement Community. Are you a relative? An old acquaintance, Edward replied. Do you happen to have any contact information for Mrs. Griffin? No, but we still get mail for her occasionally, mostly investment statements and such. I've been forwarding them to Pine Ridge. Edward thanked her and left, driving directly to the retirement community on the outskirts of town. The facility was upscale and well-maintained, with gardens and walking paths surrounding modern residential buildings. At reception, he hesitated before giving his real name. I'd like to see Elizabeth Griffin, please. The receptionist made a quick call, then directed him to a ground-floor apartment in the East Wing. Edward walked slowly, uncertain what he would say to the widow of the man who had apparently shaped his entire life from the shadows. Elizabeth Griffin answered his knock herself. She was a slight woman in her 80s, white hair cut in a stylish bob, eyes still sharp and assessing. Those eyes widened as they took in Edward's face. Edward Mercer, she said softly, not a question, but a recognition. After all these years, you look so much like your father. Edward stared, speechless. You know who I am? Elizabeth smiled gently. Of course I do. George followed your whole career. He was so proud of what you accomplished. She stepped aside. Please come in. We have much to talk about. Elizabeth Griffin's apartment was tastefully furnished with what Edward recognized as valuable antiques and artwork. Photos lined the shelves, many featuring the same man from the newspaper clippings, often standing beside Elizabeth in various global locations. She moved with the deliberate care of age, but retained an unmistakable elegance. Tea? She offered, already moving toward the kitchen. Please, Edward replied, trying to process her immediate recognition of him. Elizabeth returned with a silver tea service that looked like a family heirloom. As she poured, Edward noticed fresh flowers on George Griffin's grave in a framed photograph. On the side table, you still bring him flowers? Edward observed. Every month, Elizabeth confirmed, handing him a delicate cup. Old habits. We were married 52 years. Edward took a careful sip, gathering his thoughts. Mrs. Griffin, Elizabeth, please. Elizabeth, I'm trying to understand who George Griffin was to me, why he helped me. I've only just discovered his involvement in my life. Elizabeth settled into her chair, studying Edward with kind but penetrating eyes. George was driving on Route 18 the day of your accident, she began. He was directly behind your family's car when the truck crossed the center line. He was first on the scene. Edward's grip tightened on the teacup. He had no memory of the accident itself, only waking up in the hospital days later. George pulled. You from the wreckage, Elizabeth continued quietly. Your father was already gone. You were unconscious, badly injured. George rode in the ambulance with you because your mother was too distraught. He was just a good Samaritan, Edward asked. Finding this hard to believe, Elizabeth's gaze drifted to a photograph of a young man, her son, Edward presumed. George felt a connection to you from that moment. Our Thomas had died 10 years earlier, a similar accident when he was 16, watching you fight in that hospital bed. Something in George came back to life. She reached for a leather album on the coffee table and opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs and printouts chronicling Edward's rise. His MIT scholarship, his first company, awards and recognitions, the founding of Mercer Tech. He followed your progress from afar, Elizabeth explained. At first, it was just ensuring you had proper medical care, then educational opportunities. When you started your first company, he invested through Orchard Innovation so you wouldn't know the money came from him. But why the secrecy? Edward asked, struggling to understand. Why help anonymously? Elizabeth's expression grew thoughtful. George believed that knowing you'd had help might undermine your confidence. He wanted you to believe in yourself completely, to never doubt that your success was earned through your own merit and determination. But it wasn't. Edward said, a edge in his voice. I built my life on a foundation someone else laid. No, Elizabeth corrected gently. George only opened doors. You walked through them on your own strength. He used to say that all he did was clear away some of the extra obstacles life had unfairly placed in your path. Everything you achieved was through your own brilliance and hard work. Edward stood, too restless to remain seated. Did he keep track of me my whole life? He did. Elizabeth smiled softly. He was at your MIT graduation, sitting in the back. He attended your first major investor presentation, so proud he could barely contain himself when you fielded those technical questions. When Mercer Tech went public, we opened a bottle of champagne. Edward felt a complex swirl of emotions. Gratitude, anger, confusion. I would have liked to thank him. That was precisely what he didn't want, Elizabeth said. His deathbed request was that you never know. He wanted you to live your life free from any sense of obligation. She reached for Edward's hand. I'm breaking that promise by telling you now, but seeing you here, I think perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps you needed to know. She rose slowly and went to a small desk, returning with a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. He wrote this letter to you before he died, but never sent it. I've kept it all these years, not sure if I would ever have the chance to give it to you. Edward took the envelope with unsteady hands. His name was written on the front in a strong, precise hand. Edward stared at the envelope, suddenly unsure if he wanted to know its contents. Elizabeth seemed to understand his hesitation. Take it with you, she said gently. Read it when you're ready. He slipped the letter into his jacket pocket. Its weight seemingly disproportionate to its size. There's one more thing I need to know, he said. My mother. What happened to her? Elizabeth's expression softened with compassion. Catherine was drowning in grief and guilt. The accident broke something in her that couldn't be easily repaired. She paused, choosing her words carefully. George helped her get treatment for depression and alcohol dependency. She spent nearly 2 years in a rehabilitation facility in Arizona. And after that, Edward's voice was barely audible, she stayed there, in Sedona, built a new life. Last we heard, she was working as a counselor at the same facility that had treated her. Edward felt the room tilt slightly. She's alive? All this time? Yes, Elizabeth confirmed. George kept her updated about your progress, sent her newspaper, clippings and photographs. She wrote you letters that were never mailed. She abandoned me, Edward said, the old pain surfacing. She believed you would be better off without her, Elizabeth replied. Perhaps she was wrong, but it was never for lack of love. Edward left Elizabeth's apartment with his reality fundamentally altered. The narrative he'd constructed about his life, the abandoned, disabled boy who had pulled himself up through sheer determination and brilliance, was being rewritten with each new revelation. People had been helping him, watching over him, caring about him from the shadows all along. He drove back to his hotel in a daze, the unopened letter burning in his pocket. His phone rang. Diana again. Edward, I'm sorry to push, but this is urgent. Access Tech's CEO is threatening to walk away from the deal entirely. The board is meeting tomorrow to discuss your removal if you don't return immediately. The corporate crisis that had seemed so distant now rushed back into focus. The acquisition of Access Tech represented the culmination of Mercer Tech's accessibility initiative, a revolutionary wheelchair design that would transform mobility for thousands of users. Edward had pursued the company relentlessly, outbidding competitors, personally convincing investors of its value. Now he understood why this particular acquisition had felt so personally important. Tell Dr. Carter I'll call her personally in the morning, Edward said, and inform the board that if they wish to discuss my removal, I'll be happy to buy back their shares at market value plus 20%. Diana's surprise was evident in her silence before she finally said, I'll relay the message. In his hotel room, Edward finally opened Griffin's letter. The paper was crisp despite its age, the handwriting steady and precise. Dear Edward, if you are reading this, I am gone, and Elizabeth has decided you should know the truth. I've debated writing this letter for years, uncertain if revealing myself would help or harm you. Perhaps it's selfish to unburden myself now, but I want you to understand why I've watched over your life from a distance. When I pulled you from that wreckage on Route 18, I saw in you my son Thomas, taken from us a decade earlier. Something compelled me to ensure you had every chance he didn't, not from pity, but from a conviction that your life mattered, that you had been spared for a purpose. I watched you fight your way back from injuries that would have defeated most adults, let alone a child. I saw intelligence and determination that reminded me so much of Thomas that it sometimes took my breath away. In helping you, I found purpose again. Every step of your journey has been your own achievement. I merely removed some obstacles and opened a few doors. Your brilliance, your work ethic, your vision, these are entirely your own. I invested in your first company not out of charity, but because I believed in you. That investment has paid dividends far beyond the financial. I've kept my distance because I wanted you to own your success completely without feeling that it came through anyone's help or influence. Perhaps that was wrong. Perhaps connection is more important than the illusion of self-sufficiency. Elizabeth would say so. I've lived long enough to see you become not just successful, but influential. The technology you've created has changed lives. I wonder if you know how many people with disabilities have found opportunity through your innovations. I like to think that your experience informed your vision, though you've never spoken publicly. About your past, I am proud of you, Edward, as proud as if you were my own son. You've exceeded every hope I had for you. Whatever you think of my interference in your life, please know it came from a place of genuine care. With respect and affection, George Griffin. Edward read the letter twice, then set it aside. Emotions, too complex to name, filling his chest. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Found more journals from 1991-92. Information about your mother you should see. Outside his window, Oakridge continued its quiet evening rhythms, unaware that its prodigal son was piecing together a past he'd tried so hard to forget. Edward returned to California the following morning, the discoveries in Oakridge still churning in his mind. His driver met him at the private airfield, and within an hour he was walking into Mercer Tech headquarters, a gleaming monument to innovation he'd built from the ground up, or so he had believed. Diana intercepted him before he reached his office, concern evident in her usually composed features. The Access Tech situation is critical. Dr. Carter is waiting in the conference room. Edward nodded, switching into the familiar mode of corporate leadership despite his inner turmoil. Let's not keep her waiting. Dr. Amelia Carter was not what most people expected of a medical technology CEO. In her early 40s, with keen eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, she had transformed a small research initiative into the most innovative mobility technology company in the market. Her revolutionary wheelchair design had made Access Tech the perfect acquisition target for Mercer Tech's accessibility division. "Dr. Mercer," she greeted him coolly, "I was beginning to think you'd lost interest in our partnership." "Not at all," Edward replied, taking a seat. "Some personal matters required my attention." "Personal matters that take precedence over a $2.3 billion acquisition?" Her eyebrow raised skeptically. "That's not the Edward Mercer the business world knows." Edward studied her with new awareness. "You're right. It's not." He leaned forward. "Dr. Carter, I owe you an explanation for my absence. I've recently discovered information about my past that has shifted my perspective. I'm afraid I don't follow. The official biography of Edward Mercer omits certain details, including the fact that I spent 2 years in a wheelchair after a childhood accident." Dr. Carter's expression changed subtly. "That's not in any of the research my team compiled on you." "No, it wouldn't be. I've kept it private." He met her gaze directly. Access tech matters to me personally, not just strategically. Your technology represents what I wished had existed when I needed it. Something in her face softened slightly. Why keep that history secret? It would make a compelling narrative for your company's accessibility initiatives. I've spent most of my life distancing myself from that vulnerable child, Edward admitted. Perhaps that was a mistake. Dr. Carter seemed to consider this, then nodded. I appreciate your candor, Dr. Mercer, but my concerns about the acquisition remain. Your board's behavior during your absence suggests instability in leadership. I assure you, the leadership of Mercer Tech is not in question, Edward replied with a confidence he hadn't felt since finding the photograph. Now, shall we review the revised terms? After the meeting, which ended with a tentative agreement. To proceed, Diana followed Edward to his office. That was different, she observed. I've never heard you discuss your personal history with a business associate. Edward turned to face her. You've been with me 15 years, Diana. Did you know I used a wheelchair as a child? She hesitated. Not until recently. The board asked me to compile a complete background report when your behavior became unpredictable. You investigated me? The betrayal stung more than he expected. Edward, the board was concerned. You've never taken personal time in all the years I've worked for you. Then suddenly you disappear to a small town no one's heard you mention before. Edward sighed, the anger dissipating. I found a photograph of myself as a child, in a wheelchair, at a thrift store. It led me back to Oak Ridge, where I discovered someone has been influencing my life from the shadows. He explained about George Griffin, the anonymous donations, the trust fund, the early investment in his company, GG103, Diana said, understanding dawning. George Griffin. Yes, and there's more. Edward hesitated. Something's been bothering me about the obituary I found. It mentioned Griffin was survived by his wife, but preceded in death by his son, Thomas Griffin, Jr. And? My father's name was Thomas Mercer. What if that's not a coincidence? Diana's eyes widened. You think Griffin was related to your father? I need to find out. Edward pulled an old hairbrush from his briefcase, one of the items Elizabeth had given him from George's belongings. I want a DNA analysis, discreetly. I'll arrange it immediately, Diana promised. What are you looking for? Confirmation. Of something I'm beginning to suspect, Edward replied. That George Griffin's interest in me wasn't random charity. It was family obligation. The DNA results arrived faster than Edward expected, thanks to Diana's efficiency and Mercer Tech's private laboratory facilities. He was reviewing acquisition documents when she entered his office, tablet in hand. The analysis is complete, she said, placing the device before him. Edward stared at the screen, the scientific confirmation of what he'd begun to suspect. George Griffin and Thomas Mercer shared enough genetic markers to indicate a first-degree relationship. Brothers. My father had a brother, Edward murmured. A brother he never mentioned. There's more, Diana said, scrolling to another section. I took the liberty of comparing your DNA profile from company records. The results confirmed George Griffin was your paternal uncle. Edward leaned back in his chair, the implications washing over him. Not random charity, but family obligation. Not a stranger's kindness, but blood calling to blood. I need to speak with Elizabeth Griffin again, he said, already reaching for his phone. 2 hours later, he was on his private jet returning to Oak Ridge. By evening, he was seated once more in Elizabeth Griffin's apartment, the DNA results on the coffee table between them. I suspected you might discover this, Elizabeth said, her expression sad but unsurprised. George always said you had your father's mind, brilliant, analytical. Why didn't you tell me immediately? Edward asked, struggling to keep accusation from his voice. Elizabeth sighed, reaching for a photo album he hadn't seen during his previous visit. Because it's a painful story, and George had promised your father never to interfere in your life. She opened the album to a faded photograph of 2 young men in military uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. Thomas and George Griffin, 1963. They were inseparable as boys. Edward stared at the image. His father, decades younger than in any photo he possessed, standing beside the man who would later shape Edward's life from afar. What happened between them? Elizabeth turned the page to a newspaper clipping about Griffin Manufacturing, the family business. George and Thomas had inherited from their father. They disagreed about the company's direction. Thomas wanted to expand aggressively. George preferred stable, measured growth. The conflict became personal. Personal enough that my father changed his name? Edward asked. Elizabeth nodded. Thomas left, taking his portion of the inheritance. He changed his name from Griffin to Mercer, your grandmother's maiden name, and cut all ties with the family. George tried to reconcile many times, but Thomas refused all contact. And then the accident happened, Edward said quietly. Yes. Elizabeth's eyes grew distant with memory. The cruel irony, George happened to be driving behind your family's car that day. He recognized Thomas immediately, despite the years of separation. When he pulled you from the wreckage, her voice faltered, he said it was like being given a second chance. A second chance at what? At family. At making things right. Elizabeth reached for another photograph, this one showing George standing, at a distance, watching a college-aged Edward receiving an award. George felt responsible for the estrangement. He believed if he had handled things differently, your father might still be alive. That's irrational, Edward said. Grief often is. Elizabeth's smile was sad. He convinced himself that helping you succeed without taking credit, without imposing himself on your life, was his penance. And my mother? Did she know about this connection? Eventually. George revealed his identity when he arranged for her treatment. She was angry at first, felt he had no right to intervene. But over time, she came to accept his help. Edward struggled to process these revelations. So she knew I had family and still left me. It wasn't that simple, Edward. Elizabeth's voice was gentle but firm. Catherine was severely ill. Clinically. Depressed, self-medicating with alcohol. She couldn't care for herself, let alone a child with special needs. The choice was between placing you in foster care or allowing George to arrange for your education while she sought treatment. Why didn't she come back afterward? By then, you were thriving, excelling academically, learning to walk again. She believed re-entering your life would only disrupt the stability you'd found. Elizabeth reached for his hand. I'm not saying she was right, only that she made the decision she thought would hurt you least. Edward withdrew his hand, anger and confusion warring within him. Where is she now? Still in Sedona? Yes. At the Healing Horizon Center. She's been a counselor there for nearly 20 years. Edward stood abruptly. I need to think, to process all this. Of course. Elizabeth rose more slowly. But before you go, she went to a cabinet and returned with a small wooden box. These belonged to your father. George kept them all these years, hoping someday you might want them. Inside, the box lay a military medal, a worn leather wallet, and a family photograph showing Thomas Mercer with his wife and a young Edward, all smiling in the sunlight of what seemed like another lifetime. Edward spent a restless night at his Oak Ridge hotel, the wooden box of his father's belongings open on the nightstand. He held the wallet, worn smooth by years of use, and examined the faded family photo repeatedly. His mother looked so young, her smile untroubled by the grief that would later consume her. By morning, his decision was made. He called Diana to arrange for his jet to be ready. Where to this time? She asked, resignation in her voice. Sedona, Arizona. Edward, the Access Tech. Signing is scheduled for tomorrow. The board is already questioning your commitment. Then they can question it a little longer, Edward replied. This can't wait. 3 hours later, his rental car wound through the red rock formations surrounding Sedona. The Healing Horizon Center sat on the outskirts of town, a sprawling, Adobe complex nestled against the dramatic landscape. The sign at the entrance described it as a holistic recovery and wellness center. Edward paused in the parking lot, suddenly uncertain. What would he say to the mother he hadn't seen in 35 years? The woman who had left him to rebuild his broken body alone. The words he'd rehearsed during the flight now seemed inadequate. The reception area was serene. Earthen tones, gentle lighting, the soft sound of flowing water. A young woman greeted him with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to dealing with people in crisis. "I'd like to speak with Catherine Mercer," Edward said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked. "No, I'm her son." The woman's professional demeanor slipped momentarily, surprise flickering across her features. "I see. Let me see if she's available." Edward waited, studying the center's brochures. Healing Horizons specialized in addiction recovery, trauma counseling, and rehabilitation. According to one pamphlet, it had been operating for over 30 years. Edward! The voice came from behind him, softer, older than he remembered, but unmistakably hers. He turned slowly. Catherine Mercer stood in the doorway, a hand pressed to her mouth. At 65, her blonde hair had silvered, and fine lines mapped her face. But her eyes, his eyes, remained the same vivid blue. She wore simple clothes. Linen pants, a turquoise blouse, a silver pendant. "Edward," she repeated, as if testing the reality of his presence. "Is it really you?" He nodded, unable to find words. She approached cautiously, like someone approaching a wild animal they feared might flee. "You look so much like your father." It was the third time he'd heard those words in recent days. "May we talk somewhere private?" He managed finally. Catherine led him to a small garden courtyard, enclosed by adobe walls and shaded by desert trees. They sat on a bench, an appropriate distance apart. "I never thought I'd see you again," she said quietly, "though I've followed your life from a distance. George sent news photographs." She paused. "I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. Why didn't you come back?" The question emerged more sharply than he'd intended. Catherine didn't flinch from it. "Because I was broken, Edward. The accident that took your father, it shattered something. In me, I couldn't be the mother you deserved. So you left me with no one." "Not no one," she corrected gently. "George was watching over you, even if you didn't know it." "A shadow benefactor isn't a parent," Edward said, the old pain rising. "I needed my mother." Catherine nodded, accepting the accusation. "Yes, you did, and I failed you." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I've carried this for 35 years, my 30-year sobriety medallion." She placed it in his palm, a simple bronze coin marked with the Serenity Prayer and the number 30. "I left because I was drowning, Edward, drinking myself to oblivion. Every night, unable to care for you, consumed by guilt over the accident." Her voice remained steady, the cadence of someone who had told this story in many recovery meetings. "I had a choice. Stay and destroy us both, or leave and get help. And after you got help, what then? By then, you were thriving at school, winning academic competitions. George said you were determined to put the accident behind you, to build a new identity without the pain of the past." She met his gaze directly. "Including me." "That wasn't your decision to make," Edward said, anger coloring his words. "No, it wasn't," Catherine agreed, surprising him. "It was the decision of a woman still healing, still afraid of causing more damage. It was wrong, Edward. I've known that for years." She opened her hand, revealing several folded papers. "These are letters I wrote to you. One every year on your birthday. I never sent them, but I couldn't throw them away either." Edward stared at the papers, seeing decades of his mother's thoughts, unexpressed until now. "I don't expect forgiveness," Catherine continued. "I just want you to know that not a day has passed that I haven't thought of you, loved you, regretted my choices." She stood slowly. "I've built a life here, helping others overcome what nearly destroyed me. It doesn't make up for what I did, but it's allowed me to make some meaning from my mistakes. Edward returned to California that evening, his mind still processing the encounter with his mother. The letters she'd given him remained unread in his briefcase. He wasn't ready yet to absorb 3 decades of her undelivered thoughts. Diana met him at the airfield, her expression grave. "The board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They're questioning your leadership in light of your recent behavior." Edward nodded, unsurprised. "And Access Tech, Dr. Carter, is demanding to speak with you personally before the signing. She says she's received concerning information about Mercer Tech's commitment to accessibility technology." "What kind of information?" "She wouldn't say. But the timing suggests someone on the board may be attempting to sabotage the acquisition." Edward's jaw tightened. After decades building Mercer Tech, he'd grown accustomed to corporate politics, but rarely had they intersected so directly with his personal life. Back at his mansion, he found himself viewing the space differently. The subtle accommodations he'd designed, all carefully disguised as aesthetic choices, now seemed like elaborate lies. The slightly elevated chair heights, the gently sloped transitions between rooms, the strategically placed handrails camouflaged as decorative elements, all testimony to his desperate need to hide his past. Minerva retrieved the original Mercer Tech business plan from the secure archive, he instructed his AI system. Moments later, the document appeared on his workstation. A 20-page prospectus he'd created at 23, fresh out of MIT, burning with ambition and ideas. Edward scrolled to the mission statement. Mercer Tech will develop adaptive technologies that expand human capability, creating solutions that bridge the gap between limitation and potential. He'd written those words thinking of himself, of the gap he'd bridged between his damaged body and his soaring intellect. But somewhere along the way, as the company grew and diversified, he'd allowed that founding vision to become abstracted, a corporate platitude rather than a personal mission. The Access Tech acquisition was his attempt to return to that original purpose. The revolutionary wheelchair design incorporated AI-driven balance adjustments, terrain adaptation, and intuitive controls that responded to minimal user input. Combined with Mercer Tech's neural interface technology, it would transform mobility for thousands of users. If the board sabotaged this deal, they weren't just undermining his authority, they were betraying the company's founding purpose. Edward's phone rang. "Dr. Amelia Carter, Dr. Mercer," she began without preamble. "I've received information suggesting your board is divided on the Access Tech acquisition. Some members apparently believe our technology doesn't align with Mercer Tech's primary markets." "That's not accurate," Edward replied. "The acquisition has my full support." "Does it?" Her tone was skeptical. "Because your recent behavior suggests otherwise. Disappearing during final negotiations, delegating critical decisions. These aren't the actions of someone committed to a partnership." Edward made a decision. "Dr. Carter, I'd like to meet privately before tomorrow's board meeting. There's something you should understand about my personal stake in this acquisition." "I'm listening, not over the phone. Can you come to my home this evening?" A pause. "I'll be there at 8. After the call, Edward retrieved the photograph from his briefcase, the image of himself as a child in the wheelchair, and placed it on his desk. Then he contacted each board member individually, requesting their presence at the emergency meeting. Dr. Carter arrived precisely at 8, dressed in the same professional attire she wore to business meetings. As Edward welcomed her into his study, he noticed her slight limp, something he'd overlooked before, perhaps because he was so practiced at overlooking his own. "Thank you for coming," he said, offering her a seat. "Let's not waste time." She replied, "Why am I here, Dr. Mercer?" Edward picked up the photograph and handed it to her. "Because I believe in Access Tech's mission for reasons beyond market share or technological synergy." Dr. Carter studied the image, understanding dawning. In her eyes, "This is you." "Yes, After a car accident that killed my father when I was 10. Edward sat across from her. I spent 2 years in a wheelchair, followed by years of physical therapy and surgeries. I built Mercatech with the original mission of creating technologies that overcome limitations, inspired by my own experience. Yet you've kept this history private, she observed. I buried it, Edward corrected. Buried it so deeply that I lost sight of why I started this company in the first place. He leaned forward. The board doesn't know this history, or at least most of them didn't until recently. Some may see the Access Tech acquisition as a deviation from our current markets. I see it as a return to our founding purpose. Dr. Carter set the photograph down carefully. So, your mysterious disappearance. I found that photograph in a thrift store. It led me back to my hometown, where I discovered connections to my past I never knew existed. Edward met her gaze directly, including that I used to have a custom wheelchair myself, provided by an anonymous donor, not unlike the chairs your company is developing. 1 week later, Edward stood in the renovated Second Chances Thrift Emporium, watching as final preparations were made for the gathering. The once cluttered store had been transformed. Widened aisles, accessible displays, a new checkout counter. At wheelchair height, sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating the space where his journey had begun, with the discovery of a single photograph. "Everything's ready, Mr. Mercer," said the contractor, handing him the final inspection. "Report. Fully accessible as you requested." Edward nodded his thanks, surveying the space with satisfaction. The store's original owner, Mrs. Benson, approached with evident delight. "I still can't believe it," she said, gesturing around. "From nearly closing our doors to this, and you won't even let us put your name on anything." "The improvements speak for themselves," Edward replied. "Is the community room prepared for our guests?" "Yes, sir. Everything's arranged just as you asked." The past week had been transformative, not just for the thrift store, but for Edward himself. The board meeting that had been intended to challenge his leadership had instead become a platform for his most honest presentation in years. Standing before the board, he had shared the photograph and his story, explaining how recent discoveries had reconnected him with the original mission of Mercatech. His revelation of his childhood disability had silenced even his harshest critics. When he'd concluded by offering to buy out any board member who didn't share his vision for the Access Tech acquisition, not a single one had taken him up on it. Dr. Carter had been equally moved by his candor. After their meeting, she'd revealed her own closely guarded secret, a degenerative condition that had gradually affected her mobility over the past decade. Her brilliant wheelchair design had been born from personal necessity as much as market opportunity. Their shared experiences had transformed a business partnership into something more meaningful, a common mission. Guests began to arrive for the gathering. Margaret Chen came first, her gentle smile warming when she saw the transformed space. Elizabeth Griffin arrived shortly after, elegant despite her years. Michael Jackson, Raymond's son, brought historical photos of his father's accessibility projects. Diana represented the corporate side of Edward's life, her usual professional demeanor softened by what she'd learned about her employer's past. Dr. Carter arrived, using a sleek, understated wheelchair, an early prototype of Access Tech's revolutionary design. Edward greeted her with newfound ease, no longer hyper-aware of his own slight limp or her mobility device. Last to arrive was Catherine Mercer, her expression a mixture of trepidation and hope. Edward had spent hours on the phone with her in recent days, beginning the long process of reconstructing a relationship abandoned decades ago. It was neither simple nor painless, but it had begun. As the group assembled in the community room, Edward stood before them, the framed photograph in his hands. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "A month ago I found this photograph in this very building. What followed was a journey back to a past I'd spent decades trying to escape, a past that it turns out had never truly released me. He placed the photograph on a small display stand. In returning to Oakridge, I discovered that my life, which I had always attributed solely to my own determination and abilities, was shaped by the kindness and support of people I'd forgotten or never known. My nurse, Margaret, who documented my progress and encouraged my recovery, my Uncle George, who anonymously funded my care and education when he could have simply identified himself as family, Raymond Jackson, who made Oakridge more accessible, one building at a time, my mother Catherine, who made the painful choice to seek treatment rather than remain a destructive presence in my life. Edward gestured to the gathered group. Each of you played a part in my story, whether you knew it or not, and today I want to acknowledge that debt and hopefully begin to repay it. He unveiled architectural renderings mounted on easels. Plans for a modern, multi-story building. I've established the Griffin Foundation for Accessibility and Innovation. Its first project will be this center in Oakridge, a research and development hub focused on creating technologies that expand accessibility and independence for people with disabilities. Dr. Carter wheeled forward to stand beside him. And I'm pleased to announce that Access Tech will be relocating our primary research division to this new facility, bringing jobs and opportunity to Oakridge while developing the next generation of mobility technology. Edward watched as understanding dawned on the faces around him. This wasn't just a gesture of gratitude. It was a fusion of his past and future, a reconciliation of the child he had been with the man he had become. Michael Jackson stepped forward, holding an old photograph. "I found something you might want to see," he said, handing it to Edward. "It was in my dad's workshop archives." 1 year later, Edward stood at the window of his office in the newly completed Griffin Innovation Center. Spring sunshine bathed Oakridge in golden light, transforming the small town he'd once been so desperate to escape. Below, construction. Crews were completing the accessible community garden that would serve both the center's employees and local residents. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Splitting his time between California and Oakridge required careful balancing of corporate responsibilities and personal commitments. The Mercer Tech board had initially resisted relocating significant resources to a small town, but the success of the Access Tech integration had silenced most critics. The collaborative technologies developed over the past year had already improved mobility options for thousands of users. Edward's desk held 2 framed photographs side by side. The first, the image that had started his journey, showed a thin boy in a wheelchair. Uncertainty and determination mingled in his young face. The second, discovered in Raymond Jackson's archives, captured a moment Edward had forgotten. His first steps after 2 years in the wheelchair, George Griffin standing nearby, pride evident in his expression even from a distance. A knock at the door preceded Catherine's entrance. His relationship with his mother remained a work in progress. Decades of separation couldn't be erased overnight. But weekly dinners and shared work at the foundation had begun to bridge the chasm between them. Catherine now served as a counselor for the center's family support program, helping parents of children with disabilities navigate the emotional challenges she had once faced alone. "The new group arrives in an hour," she reminded him. "Engineering students from MIT." Edward nodded. The center's mentorship program brought promising young engineers to Oakridge for intensive workshops focused on accessibility technology. Many of the participants had disabilities themselves. A deliberate choice, reflecting Edward's belief that the best solutions came from lived experience. "I'll be down shortly," he replied, no longer hiding the slight unevenness in his gait as he moved around the desk. His phone chimed, a message from Dr. Carter, now Amelia, to him. The testing on their newest prototype was exceeding expectations. The neural interface they developed allowed wheelchair users unprecedented control and independence with minimal physical input required. It was exactly the kind of technology Edward had dreamed of as a frustrated child struggling to navigate an inaccessible world. As he prepared to leave his office, Edward paused before the wall displaying Mercer Tech's original mission statement, now prominently featured alongside the Griffin Foundation's purpose: to develop technologies that expand human capability, creating solutions that bridge the gap between limitation and potential. The words remained unchanged, but their meaning had deepened. What had once been a personal ambition, disguised as a corporate vision, had become a genuine commitment, not just to technological innovation, but to the people whose lives would be transformed by it. Edward no longer felt the need to hide his past or the slight limp that remained as its physical testament. The story of his childhood accident and recovery now featured prominently in the center's literature, not as a tale of individual triumph, but as an example of how community support and technological access could change a life's trajectory. In the building's main lobby, he passed the photograph that had once belonged solely to Margaret Chen, now enlarged and displayed alongside images of other children who had overcome similar challenges. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "Every journey begins with support. Every innovation starts with need." Outside, Edward paused to watch a young girl test-driving one of their prototype wheelchairs, her laughter echoing as she discovered its responsiveness to her commands. Her mother stood nearby, hope replacing the worry that had creased her face. When they'd arrived, this was George Griffin's true legacy, not the financial support he'd provided, but the understanding that no one succeeds entirely alone. That independence is built on a foundation of interconnection. That strength emerges not from denying vulnerability, but from acknowledging it. Edward stepped into the sunshine, the photograph of his younger self secure in his pocket. No longer a reminder of what he'd overcome, but of all those who had helped him along the way. The circle was complete.